In the year 1112, Norse settlers learned the hard way that fire alone couldn't defeat the Arctic cold. But what if the smoke itself could? Buried in the unforgiving north, where longhouses froze solid and families burned through precious wood just to survive the night, one man discovered a secret the Sami had mastered for centuries: walls that absorbed smoke, then released its heat like a vast living battery. Instead of letting warmth escape through a chimney, Arctic builders channeled smoke through hidden flues inside their walls, saturating earth, turf, and stone with heat. The result was astonishing. Clean air inside, warm walls that radiated through the long darkness, and homes that turned the cold's greatest enemy, fire's wasted smoke, into their greatest ally. This innovation didn't just keep people alive, it created a new kind of Arctic architecture and a legend of survival that spread across the North. How did Arctic builders learn to trap heat inside their walls using nothing but smoke? And how did this forgotten technology shape life in the frozen North? The year is 1112. A small group of Norse settlers, led by a man named Lars Eriksson, has established a new settlement on the edge of the vast, frozen wilderness of northern Scandinavia, near the border of what would later be called Finnmark. They have come from the green fjords of Norway, seeking new lands, new opportunities, and a life free from the petty tyrannies of the jarls and kings. They are a hardy people, accustomed to hardship, but nothing has prepared them for the brutal reality of the Arctic winter. The first winter was a lesson in survival. The cold was a living thing, a malevolent entity that seeped through the cracks in their timber and turf longhouses, stealing the warmth from their fires and the life from their bodies. They burned through their supply of firewood at an alarming rate, and still the cold was a constant gnawing presence. The children were sick, the old were dying, and the morale of the settlement was at an all-time low. Lars, a man of 40, a shipbuilder and a dreamer, knew that they could not survive another winter like this. Their longhouses, the pride of Norse architecture, were failing them. The design that had served them so well in the temperate climate of their homeland was no match for the relentless cold of the Arctic. The walls, though thick, were not thick enough. The fires, though large, were not large enough. And the chimneys, those great stone columns that were supposed to carry the smoke away, were carrying away most of the heat as well. On the 15th of February, 1113, the worst happened. Old Gunnar, the eldest of the settlers, a man who had survived 40 winters in Norway, did not wake up. He had frozen to death in his sleep, in his own bed, in his own house. The settlement was in shock. If Gunnar, the strongest and most resilient of them all, could not survive, what hope did the rest of them have? One day, in the depths of that first terrible winter, Lars was out hunting. It was the 20th of February, and the sun was a pale, distant memory. He was tracking a reindeer, and the trail led him deep into the territory of the Sami, the indigenous people of the north. He had been warned to stay away from the Sami, who were said to be a fierce and secretive people, but he was desperate. The settlement needed meat, and he was a skilled hunter. He found the Sami camp in a sheltered valley, a small cluster of low, rounded dwellings that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. They were called goahti, and they were unlike any dwelling Lars had ever seen. They were built of a framework of curved wooden poles covered with a thick layer of turf. A thin wisp of smoke rose from a hole in the roof of each dwelling, but there were no chimneys. The snow around the dwellings was packed hard, and there were signs of life, tracks of reindeer, sleds, and people. Lars, his curiosity piqued, approached the camp cautiously. He was met by a group of Sami hunters, their faces weathered and impassive. They carried spears and bows, and they looked at him with suspicion. But Lars was not a man who was easily intimidated. He laid down his own spear and raised his hands in a gesture of peace. He spoke a few words of the Sami language he had learned from traders, words of greeting and friendship. He was taken to the leader of the camp, an old man with eyes as clear and blue as the Arctic sky. His name was Ailo, and he was the Noaidi, the shaman of his people. Lars, through a mixture of gestures and the few words of the Sami language he had picked up, explained his plight. He told Ailo of the cold, the sickness, the dying. He told him of Gunnar's death. He asked for help. Ailo listened patiently. He then led Lars to one of the Goati and invited him inside. Lars had to stoop to enter through the low, tunnel-like entrance, a design that he would later understand was a clever trap for the cold air. The interior of the Goati was surprisingly spacious and warm. A fire burned in a central hearth, and the air was filled with the smell of wood smoke, reindeer hides, and cooking food. The smoke, instead of filling the dwelling, seemed to be drawn upwards towards the opening in the roof. Lars was fascinated. He had expected the interior to be dark and smoky, but it was not. The air was clear, and the light from the fire and the smoke hole illuminated the space. He placed his hand on the inner wall, a surface of smooth, dark birch bark. It was warm to the touch, radiating a gentle, even heat. It was warmer than the walls of his own longhouse, even though the fire in the Goati was much smaller. He had stumbled upon a technology that was far more advanced than anything he had ever known. The Sami had learned to live in harmony with the cold, to use the very elements that threatened the Norse settlers as a source of strength and comfort. They had learned to tame the smoke, to turn the fire's breath into a warm embrace. Ailo, seeing the wonder in Lars's eyes, smiled. He gestured to the walls, to the fire, to the smoke hole. He spoke in his own language, and though Lars did not understand all the words, he understood the meaning. The Sami had been building these dwellings for centuries, perhaps millennia. They had perfected the art of living in the Arctic, and they were willing to share their knowledge with this strange, desperate Norseman. Lars spent the rest of the winter with the Sami. He learned their language, their customs, their way of life. He learned how to build a goatee, how to hunt the reindeer, how to read the signs of the weather in the sky and the snow. And, most importantly, he learned the secret of the warm walls. The secret was in the smoke. The Sami did not see smoke as a waste product, something to be vented out of the house as quickly as possible. They saw it as a source of heat, a valuable resource to be captured and used. The smoke from the central fire was not allowed to escape freely. It was directed through a carefully designed system of channels and baffles made of stone and clay that were built into the walls of the Goati. The smoke would circulate through these channels, heating the thick turf walls, turning them into a massive thermal battery that would store the heat and release it slowly and evenly into the dwelling. The smoke also had other benefits. It cured the reindeer hides that were used for clothing and bedding, making them soft and waterproof. It kept away insects and other pests. And the soot from the smoke would coat the inner walls of the Goati, creating a dark, heat-absorbing surface that also acted as a natural preservative, protecting the wood from rot and decay. The tars and resins in the wood smoke would impregnate the turf, making it water-resistant and durable. Lars was in awe of the simple, elegant genius of the Sami design. It was a system that had been perfected over centuries of trial and error, a system that was perfectly adapted to the extreme conditions of the Arctic. He knew that he had found the answer to his people's prayers. He would take this knowledge back to his settlement and build a new kind of house, a house that would combine the strength and durability of the Norse longhouse with the warmth and efficiency of the Sami goati. In the spring of 1113, on the 1st of April, Lars returned to his settlement. He was a changed man. He had left as a desperate hunter, and he had returned as a visionary. He gathered the elders of the settlement and told them of his plan. He would build a house with warm walls, a house that would be heated by the smoke from its own fire. He would build a house that would not just survive the Arctic winter, but would thrive in it. The elders were skeptical. They were a conservative people, steeped in tradition. They trusted the old ways, the ways of their ancestors. The idea of a house with no chimney, a house that was filled with smoke, seemed like madness to them. "You will choke on the smoke, Lars," said Olaf, the eldest of the elders. "It is a fool's errand." But Lars was persistent. He built a small model of his proposed design, a miniature house with walls of turf and a tiny fireplace that vented its smoke through the walls. He demonstrated how the walls grew warm, how the smoke was contained, how the air inside remained clear. He explained the principles he had learned from the Sami, the principles of thermal mass, of smoke circulation, of heat storage. Slowly, he began to win them over. They were a practical people, and they could not deny the evidence of their own eyes. The model worked. The walls grew warm, the air was clean, the design was sound. Finally, after much debate, on the 15th of April, 1113, the elders gave him their blessing. He could build his experimental house. But there was a catch. The settlement's resources were stretched thin. They could not afford to waste precious timber and labor on such a risky venture. Lars would have to build the house himself, with the help of his family, and any volunteers he could persuade to join him. Lars accepted the challenge. He knew that the stakes were high. If he succeeded, he would save his people. If he failed, he would be a laughingstock, a fool who had chased a wild dream and led his family to ruin. But he was not deterred. He had seen the future, and he knew that it was warm. The great experiment was about to begin. The first step was to gather the materials, to lay the foundation for a new way of life in the frozen north. The future of the settlement rested on his shoulders. The race against the coming winter had begun. He had less than 6 months to build a house that would change everything. The question was not if it could be done, but if he could do it in time. The cold was coming, and it would be merciless. The work would begin at dawn. The fate of his people hung in the balance. Part 2. The winter of 1113 arrived with a vengeance. By the 1st of December, the sun was a pale, fleeting ghost, barely skimming the horizon for a few hours each day. The temperature plummeted, and the first of the great winter storms swept in from the north, a blizzard that lasted for 3 days and buried the settlement in a deep, silent blanket of snow. For the newcomers, it was a terrifying introduction to the realities of life in the far north. For the Sami, it was simply the beginning of the long darkness, a time they called Skabma Manu, the dark month. Inside the Goati, life continued. The central fire, fed with a steady supply of birch and pine, burned day and night. The smoke, thick and aromatic, filled the upper reaches of the dwelling before finding its way out through the smoke hole in the roof. The air was hazy, and the smell of wood smoke, reindeer hides, and cooking food was a constant, comforting presence. The children, their eyes accustomed to the smoky dimness, played games on the reindeer skin floor. The women mended clothes and prepared food. The men carved tools and told stories of the great hunts of the past. But for Lars, the Goati was a laboratory. He spent his days observing, measuring, and learning. He noted how the smoke, far from being a nuisance, was an integral part of the dwelling's ecosystem. It cured the reindeer hides that were stretched across the upper poles, making them waterproof and durable. It kept away the insects that would otherwise have infested the food supplies, and, most importantly, it seemed to have a profound effect on the walls of the Goati itself. On the 10th of December, 1113, during a rare moment of calm, Lars and his son, Eric, a boy of 12, were outside, clearing snow from the entrance to the Goati. Lars paused and placed his hand on the outer wall, a thick, frozen mass of turf and snow. It was cold, as expected. But then he moved to the inner wall, a surface of birch bark and wood poles that was constantly bathed in the smoke from the central fire. He had expected it to be warm, but what he felt was something more. It was a deep, radiant heat, a heat that seemed to emanate from the very substance of the wall itself. He called to his wife, Ingrid, who was inside. "Ingrid, come and feel this." Ingrid, a practical woman who had little time for her husband's strange obsessions, came to the wall and placed her hand on it. She was surprised. "It is warm," she said, "as warm as a sleeping dog." Lars knew then that he was onto something. The smoke was not just escaping through the roof. It was being absorbed by the walls, transforming them from a simple barrier against the cold into a source of heat. The turf, with its high organic content and its millions of tiny air pockets, was acting as a massive thermal battery, charged by the smoke and slowly releasing its stored heat back into the dwelling. The specific heat capacity of the turf, combined with its low thermal conductivity, made it an ideal material for storing and releasing heat. He began to experiment. On the 15th of December, he built a small experimental wall section inside the Goati, a panel of turf and birch bark that he could monitor more closely. He directed a steady stream of smoke over the surface of the panel, using a reindeer hide to create a makeshift chimney. He measured the temperature of the panel with his hands, the only instrument he had, and noted how the heat penetrated deep into the turf, how it was retained for hours after the smoke was removed. He also discovered something else. The smoke was changing the chemical composition of the turf. The soot, a fine black powder of unburned carbon, was coating the inner surfaces of the wall, creating a dark, heat-absorbing layer. The tars and resins in the wood smoke were impregnating the turf, making it more water-resistant and less prone to rot. The smoke was not just heating the wall, it was preserving it, making it stronger and more durable. The tannic acid in the smoke, a natural antiseptic, was sterilizing the surfaces, preventing the growth of mold and bacteria. By the time of the winter solstice, on the 21st of December, 1113, Lars had a new vision. He would build a new kind of dwelling, a hybrid of the Sami Goati and the Scandinavian longhouse. It would have the solid, timber-framed structure of a longhouse, but it would be heated by the smoke-based system of the Goati. He would build a house where the walls themselves were the source of heat, a house that was a living, breathing part of the fire that warmed it. He began to draw his plans in the soot on a piece of birch bark. The house would be long and low, with a steeply pitched roof to shed the snow. The walls would be of thick timber, but with a cavity, a space between the inner and outer walls that would be filled with a mixture of turf, moss, and charcoal. The heart of the house would be a massive stone fireplace, but with a crucial difference. It would have no chimney. Instead, the smoke from the fire would be directed into a network of channels, or flues, that would run through the walls of the house before being vented out through a small opening in the roof. The smoke would circulate through the walls, heating the thermal mass of the turf and stone, turning the entire house into a giant, slow-release radiator. The soot and tars from the smoke would seal and preserve the inner walls, making them black, hard, and waterproof. He presented his plan to the elders of the settlement on the 1st of January, 1114. They were skeptical. A house with no chimney? One of the elders, a man named Olaf, scoffed. You will choke on the smoke, Lars. It is madness. The smoke will not be in the house, Lars explained patiently. It will be in the walls. The house will be filled with clean, warm air heated by the walls themselves. Another elder, a man named Harold, was more concerned about the practicalities. And where will you get the stone for this great fireplace of yours? We are 100 miles from the nearest quarry. We will use the stones from the riverbed, Lars replied. The ones that have been rounded and smoothed by the water. They are dense and strong, and they will hold the heat. River stones have a high thermal mass, and they have been tested by the forces of nature for thousands of years. Slowly, painstakingly, Lars won them over. He built a small-scale model of his system, a miniature house with walls of turf and a tiny fireplace that vented its smoke through the walls. He demonstrated how the walls grew warm, how the smoke was contained, how the air inside remained clear. The elders, practical men who understood the brutal realities of the northern winter, were impressed by the simple, elegant logic of the design. On the 15th of January, 1114, they gave him their blessing. He could build his experimental house. But there was a condition. He would have to build it himself, with the help of his family and any volunteers he could persuade to join him. The settlement's resources were too precious to be wasted on such a risky venture. Lars accepted the challenge. He knew that he was not just building a house, he was building a new future for his people in this harsh and unforgiving land. The work would be long and hard. The materials would have to be gathered from the surrounding forest and tundra. The techniques were new and untested, and the long, dark winter was far from over. As he stood outside the Goati on that cold January day, looking out at the endless expanse of snow and ice, he felt a surge of determination. He would build a house that would tame the smoke, a house that would turn the fire's breath into a warm embrace. He would build a house that would not just survive the Arctic winter, but would thrive in it. The challenge was immense, but the prize was survival itself. The great experiment was about to begin. The first step was to gather the stones, the foundation of his radical new vision. The river was frozen solid, but beneath the ice lay the raw materials of his revolution. The work would begin at dawn. The future of the settlement depended on it. The question was no longer if it could be done, but if he could do it in time. The next winter was only 10 months away. The race against the cold had begun. The stakes were life and death. The house would be built, or they would all perish. There was no middle ground. Part 3. The spring of 1114 came late and reluctantly. The snows began to melt in April, and by the 1st of May the river was once again a torrent of icy water. For Lars and his small team of volunteers, it was the beginning of a season of frantic, back-breaking labor. They had to gather all the materials for the new house before the first snows of the next winter, which could come as early as September. The first task was to gather the stones for the fireplace and the foundation. They waded into the icy river, prying the smooth, rounded stones from the riverbed. It was cold, wet, and dangerous work. On the 15th of May, a young man named Bjorn slipped on a mossy rock and was swept downstream. He was pulled from the water, half drowned and hypothermic, but he survived. The incident was a stark reminder of the dangers of this land, and it shook the morale of the small group. Next came the timber. They ventured into the sparse, stunted forests of the high valleys, felling the hardy birch and pine trees. The logs were heavy and awkward to transport. They used reindeer to drag the logs back to the building site, a slow and laborious process. By the summer solstice on the 21st of June, they had a large pile of timber, but it was not enough. They would need more, much more. Then came the turf. They cut the turf from the tundra in large, thick blocks, a process that was like skinning the earth itself. The turf was heavy with water and had to be left to dry in the sun. But the summer was short, and the sun was often weak. By the end of July, much of the turf was still damp. As the summer wore on, the challenges mounted. A sudden, unseasonable storm on the 10th of August destroyed a large section of the partially built walls. A sickness swept through the settlement in late August, laying low several of Lars's key workers. The days were getting shorter, the nights colder. The specter of the coming winter loomed over them, a constant, oppressive presence. Lars pushed himself and his team relentlessly. He worked from dawn until dusk, his body aching, his hands raw. He was driven by a desperate sense of urgency, a fear that they would not finish in time. His wife, Ingrid, begged him to slow down, to rest. "You will kill yourself, Lars," she said to him on the 1st of September, as he worked late into the night, laying stones by the light of a flickering seal oil lamp. "If we do not finish this house," he replied, his voice grim, "the winter will kill us all." By mid-September, the house was beginning to take shape. The timber frame was complete, and the walls were being filled with the mixture of turf, moss, and charcoal. The massive stone fireplace, the heart of the house, stood in the center, a monument to their labor. But the most difficult and dangerous part of the construction was yet to come, the creation of the smoke channels within the walls. This was a technique that Lars had invented, and it was fraught with risk. The channels had to be carefully constructed to ensure a smooth, even flow of smoke. If they were too narrow, they would clog with soot. If they were too wide, the smoke would cool too quickly and would not heat the walls effectively. And if there were any leaks, the house would fill with deadly carbon monoxide. On the 20th of September, with the first snowflakes of the season beginning to fall, they lit the first fire in the great stone fireplace. It was a moment of truth. The entire settlement gathered to watch, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Lars stood by the fireplace, his heart pounding. He had checked and rechecked every joint, every seam, every stone. But he knew that there was no way to be certain that it would work until it was tested. He lit the fire. A thick column of smoke rose from the flames and was drawn into the opening of the smoke channel. For a moment, nothing happened. The crowd held its breath, and then a thin wisp of smoke was seen escaping from the vent in the roof. The channel was drawing. The system was working. A cheer went up from the crowd, but Lars did not celebrate. He was watching the walls, his hand pressed against the inner surface. He could feel a faint warmth spreading through the timber, a sign that the smoke was beginning to do its work. But the real test would come when the fire was burning at full intensity, when the walls were saturated with heat and smoke. They kept the fire burning for 3 days. The house was filled with the smell of hot stone and drying turf. The walls grew steadily warmer, until they were radiating a gentle, even heat. The air inside the house was warm and, most importantly, clear. There was no smoke. The system was a success, but their triumph was short-lived. On the night of the 23rd of September, a new crisis emerged. A strange, acrid smell began to fill the house. It was not the smell of wood smoke, but something else, something sharp and unpleasant. The children began to cough. Ingrid's eyes were watering. Lars, his heart sinking, knew what it was. The heat from the smoke channels was beginning to bake the turf in the walls, releasing the volatile organic compounds that had been locked within it for centuries. The air was becoming toxic. They had to extinguish the fire. The house, once a symbol of hope, was now a source of poison. The elders, who had been so impressed by the initial success, now looked at Lars with accusation in their eyes. "You have failed, Lars. Olaf said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You have built a house that poisons its own air." Lars was devastated. He had foreseen the risk of smoke leaks, but he had not anticipated this. He had solved one problem, only to create another. The winter was closing in. The first of the great storms was gathering in the north, and the house, their only hope of survival, was uninhabitable. He spent the next 2 days in a state of despair. He had led his family and his followers to the brink of disaster. He had gambled everything on his vision, and he had lost. The settlement would have to face the winter in their old, cold, and inefficient dwellings, and it was all his fault. But as he sat in the cold, silent house, staring at the blackened walls, a new idea began to form in his mind. It was a desperate, radical idea, born of his despair. The problem was the turf. It was too organic, too full of impurities. He needed a different kind of thermal mass, something that was clean, stable, and could withstand the intense heat of the smoke channels. He knew what he had to do. He would have to rebuild the walls. But this time he would not use turf. He would use the one material that was abundant in this land, the one material that was pure and clean and had been tested by fire and ice for millennia. He would use the earth itself. He would rebuild the walls with a mixture of clay and sand, the same materials that had been used to build the great ovens and kilns of his homeland. He would create a house of baked earth, a house that was a single, monolithic ceramic vessel heated from within by the fire's breath. It was a monumental task. The first snows had already fallen. The ground was beginning to freeze. To dig the clay and sand they needed would be almost impossible, and they would have to work in the bitter cold, with the constant threat of storms. It was a race against time, a desperate gamble against the encroaching winter. But it was their only hope. On the 26th of September, Lars gathered the few remaining volunteers. He explained his new plan. They looked at him as if he were mad, but they also saw the fire in his eyes, the unyielding determination of a man who would not be defeated. And they agreed to follow him one last time. The great gamble had begun. The fate of the settlement and the future of smoke-heated architecture hung in the balance. The winter was coming, and it would be the ultimate judge of their success or failure. The question was no longer whether the house would be warm, but whether it could be built at all. The race against the freezing earth had begun. The stakes were no longer just survival, but the very soul of their community. The fire was out. But a new, more desperate fire had been lit in the heart of their leader. The house would be built. It had to be. The alternative was unthinkable. The cold was coming, and with it the final test of their courage and ingenuity. The battle for the warm walls was about to enter its most desperate and decisive phase. The earth itself would be their salvation or their tomb. Part 4. The work that followed was a blur of desperate, frost-bitten labor. The ground was as hard as iron, and the task of digging the clay and sand was a brutal, soul-destroying struggle. They used the antlers of reindeer as picks, and their own hands, wrapped in rags, to scoop the frozen earth into baskets. The wind was a constant, biting presence, and the temperature rarely rose above freezing, even in the middle of the day. They worked in shifts, day and night, by the light of the moon and the flickering aurora borealis. The women and children joined the effort, their small hands helping to mix the clay and sand with water to create a thick, heavy cob. The mixture was then packed into the wall cavities, a slow, laborious process that had to be done before the cob froze solid. By the end of October, the walls were complete. The house was now a solid, monolithic structure of baked earth, timber, and stone. But the ordeal was not over. The cob had to be dried, and the only way to do that was to light the fire in the great stone fireplace and bake the house from within. On the 1st of November, 1114, with a great storm raging outside, they lit the fire. This time there was no ceremony, no crowd of onlookers. There was only a small group of exhausted, hopeful people, huddled together in the heart of their creation. The smoke was drawn into the channels, and the walls began to warm. The moisture in the cob turned to steam, and the house was filled with a thick white fog. For 3 days the house was a giant sauna, the water running down the inner walls in streams. But then, on the 4th day, the fog began to clear. The walls were dry, and they were radiating a deep, steady, and, most importantly, clean heat. The air inside the house was warm and fresh. The system was working. They had done it. They had built a house of fire and earth, a house that could defy the Arctic winter. The first great test of the new house came in mid-November. A blizzard, the likes of which even the Sami elders had never seen, descended on the settlement. The storm raged for a week, and the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The wind howled like a demon, and the snow piled up in massive drifts, burying the smaller traditional dwellings completely. But inside the smoke-heated house, it was a different world. The walls, now fully charged with heat, radiated a gentle, constant warmth. The air was fresh and clean. The fire in the great stone fireplace needed to be fed only twice a day. The house was a sanctuary, an island of warmth and safety in the heart of the storm. One by one, the families from the other dwellings, their own fires failing, their food supplies running low, made their way to the new house. They were taken in, and the house, designed for a single family, became a communal shelter, a testament to the spirit of cooperation that had built it. But the storm was not the only danger they faced. On the 5th day of the storm, a new threat emerged. A pack of wolves, driven by hunger, descended on the settlement. They were large, fearless, and desperate. They circled the house, their howls a terrifying counterpoint to the shriek of the wind. They clawed at the walls, their teeth tearing at the timber frame, but the walls, now baked as hard as stone, held firm. Then the wolves found a weak point, a small, unshuttered window high up on the leeward side of the house. One of the wolves, a huge black male, leaped at the window, its claws finding a purchase on the timber frame. It began to tear at the opening, its snarling face appearing in the gap. Panic erupted inside the house. The children screamed. The women cried out in fear. The men grabbed their spears and axes, but they knew they were no match for the pack. But Lars, his mind sharpened by months of desperate problem-solving, saw an opportunity. He grabbed a bucket of water and threw it at the wolf. The water, in the 40 below zero air, froze almost instantly, coating the wolf's fur in a sheet of ice. The wolf, shocked and suddenly burdened by the weight of the ice, lost its grip and fell back into the snow. Lars had an idea. He organized the men. They would fight the wolves not with spears, but with water. They boiled water over the fire, and, using a makeshift system of buckets and levers, they hurled the boiling water at the wolves. The effect was devastating. The boiling water scalded the wolves, and the intense cold then flash-froze their fur, encasing them in a tomb of ice. The battle raged for an hour. The wolves, driven by a primal hunger, were relentless, but the defenders, armed with their strange new weapon, were equally determined. One by one, the wolves were defeated, their frozen bodies littering the snow around the house. As dawn broke on the 6th day of the storm, the wind began to die down. The snow stopped falling. The storm was over. The survivors emerged from the house to a scene of devastation. The settlement was buried in snow. The other dwellings were crushed or frozen, but the smoke-heated house stood firm, a symbol of their resilience, their ingenuity, and their courage. They had survived. They had faced the worst that the Arctic could throw at them, and they had won. The house had not just saved them from the cold, it had saved them from the wolves. It had been their fortress, their sanctuary, their salvation. News of the smokehouse and the battle with the wolves spread through the region. Traders and trappers who passed through the settlement in the spring of 1115 carried the story with them, and the legend of Lars and his house of fire and earth began to grow. The house became a model for a new kind of Arctic architecture, a design that was copied and adapted by settlements across the north. The principles of the smoke-heated wall, the thermal mass, and the chimneyless fireplace were refined and improved over the centuries, becoming a cornerstone of vernacular architecture in the far north. Lars had not just built a house, he had created a new technology, a new way of living in harmony with the harsh realities of the Arctic. He had taken the ancient wisdom of the Sami and combined it with his own innovative spirit, creating something that was both traditional and revolutionary. Part 5. The years that followed the great storm of 1114 were a time of rebuilding and renewal. The smoke-heated house, once a radical experiment, was now the heart of the settlement. Its design was copied and improved upon, and a new village of warm, safe, and efficient houses rose from the ashes of the old. The principles of Lars's design spread throughout the north. The use of smoke to heat a thermal mass of earth and stone became a common practice in many Arctic and subarctic cultures. The Finnish savusauna, or smoke sauna, which was first documented in writing in 1112, the Russian banya po Chernomu, or black banya, and the smokehouses of the Scandinavian north all share a common ancestry with Lars's invention. They are all based on the same fundamental principle that smoke, if properly managed, can be a source of heat, not just a waste product. The savusauna was a central part of Finnish life for over 2,000 years. It was not only used for warmth and cleanliness, but also as an infirmary where women gave birth, where the sick sought treatment, and where the dying found peace. The smoke contained tannic acid that sterilized the surfaces, making it a safe and hygienic environment. The temperature in a savusauna could reach 80 to 110 degrees Celsius, and the smoke would be allowed to fill the sauna for several hours before being vented out, leaving behind a warm, clean space. The Russian banya po Chernomu, or black banya, was similar in principle. It had no chimney, and the smoke would escape through a hole in the ceiling. The smoke would heat the walls and the large stones in the stove, creating a massive thermal battery that would release heat for hours after the fire was extinguished. The banya was a place of purification, both physical and spiritual, and it was an integral part of Russian culture. Lars lived to see his vision become a reality. He passed away in the winter of 1145 at the age of 75, a respected elder and the patriarch of a thriving community. He was buried on a hill overlooking the settlement, his grave marked by a simple stone cairn. He left behind no great wealth, no titles, no monuments. His legacy was in the warm walls of the houses he had inspired, in the lives that had been saved by his ingenuity, in the quiet, resilient culture that had taken root in this harsh and beautiful land. Today, the ruins of that first smoke-heated house can still be seen. The timber frame has long since rotted away, but the massive stone fireplace and the baked earth walls, as hard as ceramic, have endured. They are a testament to a forgotten chapter in the history of architecture, a story of innovation, resilience, and the enduring power of a simple, elegant idea. The principles of the smoke-heated wall are being rediscovered today by a new generation of architects and builders who are seeking to create sustainable, energy-efficient buildings. The concept of the thermal mass, the use of natural, locally sourced materials, and the principle of passive heating are all cornerstones of modern green architecture. The masonry heater, a highly efficient wood-burning stove that uses a labyrinth of smoke channels to heat a large thermal mass, is a direct descendant of Lars's invention. These heaters can achieve combustion efficiencies of over 90%, and they can heat a home for 12 to 24 hours with a single firing. We have learned, as Lars did, that the most elegant solutions are often the simplest. We have learned that the key to sustainable living is to work with nature, not against it. We have learned that the most valuable resources are not gold or silver, but ingenuity, courage, and the will to survive. The story of Lars and his smoke-heated house is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a parable for our times. It is a reminder that even in the face of the most extreme challenges, we have the capacity to innovate, to adapt, and to create a better future for ourselves and for our children. It is a story of hope, a story of resilience, a story of the enduring power of the human spirit. In the heart of the Arctic, where the winter is long and the cold is a constant threat, the legacy of Lars the Builder lives on. It lives on in the warm walls of the houses, in the stories that are told around the fire, in the quiet, unyielding strength of a people who have learned to live in harmony with one of the most extreme environments on Earth. The fire in the walls has not gone out. It is still burning, a silent testament to a man who dared to dream of a house that could turn smoke into warmth, a house that could tame the Arctic winter, a house that could build a future in the heart of the cold, a fortress of fire and earth. The smoke had become their shield, the fire their ally. The Arctic had met its match. The age of the warm walls had begun.